So here's roughly what I think happened. I think that the apostles took the linens. I think that they kept those linens for themselves. They probably showed them to a small select group of people because it was already weird enough that Jesus had risen from the dead.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And as always, we're going to be talking about this wonderful cloth, and especially now, right after Easter, and certainly the celebration of the resurrection, and this potentially being the only witness, which of course is the title of my book, The Only Witness to that resurrection and that miraculous event. And so, if you want more information, though, about signing up potentially for this episode and others, please visit guypowell.com. And today we're speaking with Duran Smith, and he is a longtime researcher and historian and basically speaker and a bunch of stuff on the Shroud. And so, and he's been on here before. We talked about some really cool stuff the last time. And but anyway, Duran, good to have you, and it was so good to have you the last time speaking about whether the image on the shroud was printed or not. Today, we're going to talk a little bit more about a little bit more on the history of the shroud after the resurrection. What happened to that cloth? And so, Duran, so good to have you. Welcome.
Before we continue, I want to briefly tell you about my new book, The Only Witness. It's a work of Christian historical fiction rooted in years of serious research into the Shroud of Turin. The story traces what may have happened to the Shroud across 2,000 years of history through war, secrecy, faith, and survival. It puts you right into the story. If you're interested in the historical mystery behind the Shroud and its possible journey over the last 2 millennia, you can learn more and order your copy at guypowell.com or on Amazon. Now let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me back. It's always great to talk about the Shroud. I've been really passionate about digging into this stuff, but as we're going to get into, it's a lot.
Yeah.
The history gets really involved, but it is interesting that there is a good bit to work with, and I think that a lot of people who are even familiar with the science around the shroud are probably still not very familiar with a lot of the historical data that we have, and of course we still have a lot of sorting to do in terms of what we do with all of that data. But yeah, I mean that's what we're going to get into today.
Yeah, and there are, and you're so right. There's so many different references, and then there's confusion or conflation or whatever, who knows, with other artifacts like the image of Edessa or the image of Camuliana or the veil of Veronica or the veil of Mount Apello, and I don't even know. There's probably maybe even
Yeah,
others, but
probably
those are the
more.
ones that come to mind right now. That's right. So tell us. So give us like what you think happened and or some hypotheses as to where it may have been and then we'll discuss that and go from there.
Yeah. So I guess maybe the easiest thing is to just say outright what I think happened, like in terms of, you know, before we go into all of the data, because it's a lot to put together. Just let me go ahead and show you what the whole puzzle looks like. I think. Um, I mean, what I think and what we talked about last time was kind of the gospel references to the burial linens. So we've already talked about that in terms of uh, does the gospel text contradict the shroud in terms of the burial method that was used for Jesus? And I think the conclusion is pretty solidly no. There's no contradiction there. But then the question becomes, of course, well, then what happened to it? Who took it? Who kept it? I mean, obviously, Peter and John were the ones there in the tomb, and John is the one who specifically said that he saw the handkerchief set aside in a different place. So clearly they saw the linens there, but it doesn't say that they took them. So here's roughly what I think happened. I think that the apostles took the linens. I think that they kept those linens for themselves. They probably showed them to a small select group of people because it was already weird enough that Jesus had risen from the dead. Um, and I think we did mention last time, it's like, well, why wouldn't they show the shroud to anybody? Well, it was because the resurrected Jesus was walking around with them, for 40 days, which is significantly more impressive than an image on a cloth. Um, and it's very possible that the miraculous nature of that image, it may not have even occurred to them in those first early days while they're literally physically clinging to the resurrected Christ. So I think that they probably kept it to themselves for the most part. And then I think that they probably took it around and just showed it to people in different cities, sort of exclusively. Probably used it as an evangelism tool. Now, who had it and who was traveling with it, it's hard to say. Maybe Peter, maybe John. It's possible that maybe Paul had it for a little bit. I'd like to discuss the reference in Galatians 3:1. It could be a reference to the shroud. What I think happened after that, though, so we know that the Christians were using the Eucharistic ceremony. In other words, the communion ceremony, where they would bless the bread and the wine, and they regarded it as the true flesh of Christ and the true blood of Christ. And we know that they were using those ceremonies as not necessarily initiation, but as sort of confirmation of people's inclusion into the church as true Christians. And there's a lot that could be said about that from the Catholic versus Protestant perspective, but I don't want to get into all that, right now. But these Eucharistic ceremonies were held in private. They weren't available to everybody. They were only for believers. And even the Apostle Paul says that very specifically in his letters, that the Eucharist ceremony is only for believers, people who have made their peace with God and have also made their peace with others. So we know that those meetings were being held, maybe not in secret, but in private for sure. And there is some historical data surrounding the shroud that gets very veiled with what we would call the discipline of the secret. It was this coded language that early Christians were using in the early centuries to refer to these Eucharistic ceremonies. And they were doing it that way, of course, because they were facing persecution and they didn't want certain people to know exactly what they were talking about. But if you look at some of these texts that are written in this style of discipline of the secret, it seems like they are referring to some kind of image of Christ that was being brought out in some of these ceremonies. And obviously the shroud can only be in one place at one time. So it seems like the shroud was probably being used in those early centuries in these private Eucharistic ceremonies. And we have evidence from later on in history that it definitely was being used for those purposes later on, because it has, the wax drippings on it, the holes that were put in it, the poker holes, as the Hungarian Prayer Codex sort of depicts later on. And then I think that it was probably just passed around from city to city, going from one person's care to another person's care, between Antioch, maybe Odessa, bouncing around that whole region until it sort of exploded into public view at some point in the 6th century or so, which is when the art of Jesus completely changes and starts to look like the shroud. Now, it's possible that the shroud was hidden away in a particular city for a century or two, maybe in Antioch, maybe in Odessa, but then it was taken up to Constantinople, where it was kept in the in the temple there. And that's where we have, I think, very clear records from that point on of this image in particular being there. So I think that's basically a rough summary of what we can say about how the shroud got from Jerusalem to Constantinople, and then of course from Constantinople it was taken up into Europe. Would you agree with that summary, or would you want to
Yeah,
add
there's a
anything
lot
to
of
that?
little nuance in there, which is fascinating because the discipline of the secret, I think, is so is a big piece of it. Certainly for the first couple hundred years after in the first and second and maybe and then well in the third century and probably all the way through 313 with Constantine and then his what was it called? His edict, the Edict of Milan, and then the second edict after that. And then of course things got a little bit dicey immediately after Constantine because then you have Julian the apostate, I think. Then he was no longer he was not Christian, and so he was kind of, the Christians kind of had to go back into hiding. Not that they were necessarily being persecuted, but they were probably uncertain as to whether they were going to be persecuted or not. And then after Julian
Yeah,
the apostate, then it was more or less Christian in the Roman Empire thereafter. One thing though is kind of fascinating. You have this cloth based on the Gospels, and that cloth is was purchased by Joseph of Arimathea. That's what I think is in Mark and Matthew, and whether he purchased it before or whether he purchased it that day. It's who knows, but it definitely says that he purchased it. So when John and Peter then run up to the tomb and see it, and of course then John says, I saw and believed. Then what happened to that cloth right there? One of those linens, and then of course there's how we want to define whether it was linens or whether it was one big cloth or whether it was a whole bunch of strips or whatever, and kind of like what we envision with so anyway, we have a cloth, and so you wonder if then there was a discussion between John and Peter and then Joseph of Arimathea said, well, hey, listen, I know it's your cloth, but it's got this image on it, and it's got his blood on it, and you're a Jew, so you don't want to touch it, of course, and so even though they were Jews, Peter and John were Jews at the time. And so then they probably also were wondering, well, should we touch it, or how do we handle it with this blood on there? So some interesting questions as they're trying to figure out what happened to it. Certainly
yeah,
it ended up, I think, I think I would agree with you, it ended up with Peter or John thereafter. I don't think it would have been right for Joseph of Arimathea to have kept it, and then,
yeah.
because it would be so valuable to Christians.
There are some really interesting legends from the second and third centuries that sort of introduce a bunch of speculation about what happened to these burial linens. And what's really interesting about this is that, so far as I've been able to find, these burial linens are really the only relics of the Jesus story that are mentioned in these early legends. It's not until really the fourth century when Constantine's wife starts like digging around to find basically, I guess, their version of archaeological evidence of everything. She starts looking for relics, but before then, there's very little in the uh, ante-Nicene church fathers about any kind of relics, or in the Gnostic Gospels, for example. But
Right.
the one thing that pops up pretty commonly is these burial linens. And that sort of gives us an interesting historical insight that perhaps maybe there was something to those linens that people were aware of and it really caused people to wonder, uh, you know, where are these things? What happened to them? And why would it be important anyway if it's just blood soaked cloth? Now, granted, it's the blood of Jesus, but then who kept it and who went with it? So there's some really interesting legends along those lines. Actually, so the Gospel of Peter, which is which is Gnostic, it's later, it's like mid second century, so it's not actually from Peter. It mentions the burial linens. We also have a reference from Saint Jerome from from either the late fourth century or early fifth century, and he is quoting what was called the Gospel of the Hebrews, which was an early second century text. And in that Gospel of the Hebrews, supposedly Jesus gives the burial cloth to someone called the servant of the priest. And we don't really know who that was, but apparently he gave that cloth to this servant of the priest, and then he went and appeared to his brother James. So that happens early on in that legend. We have another one from the fourth century called the Gospel of Nicodemus, that says that where basically like Jesus is speaking with Joseph of Arimathea, and he refers to these linen cloths and the napkin that was placed over his face. So just really interesting details in there. And one of my favorites too is a lady named Saint Nino. So she was born in Cappadocia, right at the very end of the third century, and she did spend some time in Jerusalem, and she ended up moving to the region of Iberia, which is modern day Georgia, when she was 14 years old. And then later on, and she became sort of a teacher in the church from her experience having lived in Jerusalem and then moving up. And then in the fifth century, some of her oral traditions were preserved in what are called the hagiographies. Anyway, all that to say that according to these legends that came from her, uh, the the burial linen actually ended up with Pontius Pilate's wife, and that uh, she had specifically asked for the linens, and she took them to her hometown. And then also, according to Saint Nino, the linens eventually came into the hands of Luke. Uh, Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and the Book of Acts. And she said that he put it in a place known only to himself.
Mm-hmm.
And she also mentions the Sudarium, that it belonged to Peter, but she also says that nobody knows if it's ever been discovered or who took it after Peter or who kept it. So even though this is just legendary material passed down through oral traditions, there's still some interesting bits in there about the fact that when she says that we don't even know where these things are anymore, it sort of lends a kind of criteria of embarrassment to the story, where she's admitting that this is what I heard, but I have no idea where these things are anymore. So it makes it sound like there's some kind of validity to these stories, even if it does sound a little weird that Pontius Pilate and his wife would have ended up with the cloths.
No,
No,
I
but
was
go
going to
ahead.
say Pontius Pilate's wife was, she was certainly not a fan of crucifying Jesus, and
Yeah.
she was basically, almost a Christian. And then and I don't know if there's any mention in there, but there is I don't know if it's called the Gospel of Pontius Pilate or something like that, but there's also one from him as well. A writing,
Yeah.
an apocryphal writing, of course, and so it's fascinating to see these old writings, and then a lot of them don't exist anymore. But then, like you were mentioning, Saint Jerome, who was later, he saw those. And he
Yeah.
then wrote about what was in them. So it's kind of like, well, there's some proof that there was some document that existed that he then referenced in whatever it was that he wrote. So that
Yeah.
history and what those documents or scrolls or their parchments or whatever they were written on, whatever happened to them, and certainly over time they disappeared or were burned up or whatever. So
Yeah. I mean, we don't have any solid historical record of what happened to Pontius Pilate or his wife once he was no longer in power. Um, but we do have these legends from church tradition that say that he and his wife actually did eventually become Christians. And it's interesting because the legends surrounding Pontius Pilate and the burial linens of Jesus get even crazier. By the fifth and sixth centuries, we get what's called the Gospel of Gamaliel. And again, this is way later. This is centuries later. But according to
mm,
the Gospel of Gamaliel, um, Jesus gives the burial linens to Pilate, and then Pilate uses the linen to actually wrap one of the thieves who was crucified with Jesus and resurrect him using the burial linens. And he also heals a guy who was blind in one eye, according to those legends as well. So it's just really interesting that like why would the burial linen be the thing that would do the healing when you already have the story of the woman being healed from touching Jesus's garment right there. It's like
right.
why not use that instead? Uh, I'm not saying that I think that Pilate actually ended up with the shroud or that he used it to heal anybody, but the fact that these stories were circulating and they were speculating about who had these burial linens is just really telling that there may be something to that. Um,
Yeah, how interesting. It's funny. I've been researching the what's called the Mandylion or the image of Edessa, and tracking, where it may have been. Certainly, there's no proof to it, although there's certainly a lot of opinions and various hypotheses. And I'm going to have to now add all of these apocryphal writings to it,
yeah,
and see, because those writings, there are some traditions that exist certainly in Edessa about the what happened with the shroud or the image of Edessa. And now there's one writing that actually is in the Bible, in the Gospels, with Paul, on Galatians 3:1. Tell us about that one.
yeah. Um, I spent a good bit of time on this one, I gotta say, because when I heard that there was a possibility that there might be a reference to the shroud, a shrouded reference to the shroud, pun intended, of course. Um, that is shroud researchers' favorite pun. Everything is shrouded in mystery. Uh, when I heard that there might be this reference to the shroud in Galatians, I was like, "Oh man, I've got to spend some time on this." And it's a verse that I think everybody's read. Of course, I mean, if you've read Galatians, it's a relatively short letter. It's also considered one of Paul's earliest letters. So, and what that means is that virtually no historian disputes that Paul actually wrote it. It's not one of the ones that's sort of up in the air. It's like, no, Paul actually wrote this. So in Galatians chapter 3, right there in verse 1 at the beginning of the chapter, uh, Paul is getting on to the Galatians, and he says, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was clearly portrayed in your midst as crucified?" And this is such a really curious verse because I think for the layperson who reads this, they just sort of they just sort of make assumptions in their head because they don't know what else to imagine. There's like, okay, so the Galatians were told about the crucifixion. Uh, Maybe some of the Galatians were present at the crucifixion, but that's weird because Galatia is not relatively close to Jerusalem. So, what exactly is Paul talking about here? And if you look at commentaries and translations, even commentators and scholars don't really know what to do with this verse. It's worded very strangely. It sounds like, even on first reading, it sounds like something was shown to the Galatians, but because there's nothing commonly known to church-going people as to what they could have been shown, it just sort of goes past us. We just assume, maybe he wrote them a letter or drew them a picture or something. And this is sort of the route that commentators go. It's like some of them even go so far as to say maybe they were acting out the crucifixion story or something like that. So they have these routes. But what's interesting is if you start with the shroud and you say, okay, well, I do believe that these burial linens were probably being passed around. And today we have this thing called the Shroud of Turin. Looks like the burial cloth of Christ. It's got his blood on it, and it's got his miraculous image on it. If this thing actually came from Jesus's tomb in the first century, then who had it, and what were they using it for? What were they passing it around to do, if anybody had it? And Galatians 3:1 might be the answer here. So I really dug into, there's 7 or 8 really particular things you can pick out of this verse to show that it could possibly be an allusion to the shroud, a very secretive allusion, granted, because even Paul, I think they would have wanted to keep this thing private, not secret, so to speak, but just private. They wouldn't want that information just being passed around everywhere. In the same way that they wouldn't tell everyone where all of the house churches were, because they didn't want, Romans come and hunting them down. So the first thing is that it had to be tangible. It had to be something tangible because Paul specifically says that it was in their midst. And you wouldn't say in your midst if it was just something that had been taught to them. It has to be something that could be passed around between them, something that could be actually physically present with them. That's what that terminology implies. The second thing is that it would have to be a visual depiction of some sort, because that's what the language of before whose eyes implies. It implies that something was shown to them. And this is very different language than just reading a letter. It's that something appeared before their eyes that was there in their midst. So those are the first 2 things. The third thing that's probably more obvious was that it depicted Jesus as crucified, which is clearly what the shroud is. Of course, it's a depiction of Jesus's crucifixion and the after effects of that crucifixion, with all of his scourge wounds and his nail wounds through the wrist and through the ankles. It also would have to be a very emotionally powerful tool of some sort. Whatever it was that was shown to them, it would have to be very emotionally powerful for them in order for Paul to say that they're foolish for having forgotten whatever it was that they saw or whatever they had come to believe about Jesus's crucifixion. It also had to be very persuasive because he says it was clearly portrayed in their midst. It wasn't something that was unclear. It wasn't something that was mysterious or questionable, maybe. It was something that was very persuasive to them. It was clearly before them. Also, it could have plausibly been something that was supernatural, because he speculates that somebody must have bewitched them. Somebody must have put a spell on them, or somebody must have cursed them, or in some way put a spell on them in order for them to no longer believe this sign that they had been given. And I think that's really powerful that he uses that language. And the other part of it too that's really interesting is it seems to have been a singular experience, something that happened to them maybe just once, because Paul is clearly appealing to their memory. He's not saying that whatever they saw is still there. He's speaking as if this was a past event, like it was there. And at least some of them had seen this portrayal of Jesus's crucifixion before their very eyes in their midst. So when you add all of that up, it's like 8 things. It had to be tangible, it had to be a visual depiction, it had to be a depiction of the crucifixion, it was emotionally powerful, it was persuasive, it was possibly supernatural, and it was a singular experience in the past. So when you put all of those things together, it doesn't prove that it was the shroud, but what it means is that the shroud perfectly fits those details. And in terms of anything else that could have been shown to them, we have no idea what else that could have been. Um, I don't think that just showing them written scripture is quite the same thing. Or I don't think that teaching about Jesus fulfilling the prophecies in Isaiah, for example, quite fulfills that. As powerful as that is, I don't think it quite fulfills these descriptions that Paul is using in Galatians 3:1. So, in my mind, at least, when I read Galatians 3:1, it seems to me like the shroud is the only thing that really fits the mold of what he's talking about there. It's the kind of thing that he would be upset that they would have forgotten or no longer cared about for some reason. And of course, all of this has to be read into the broader context of Galatians as well, and the theological difficulties that they were having that Paul was also addressing as well. So this detail is just sort of thrown in there in the middle of it, and it's like, how does this relate exactly? It's like, no, because the blood of Jesus took care of your salvation. It was clearly portrayed among you. Jesus was clearly portrayed among you as crucified. So do you have to do these other works like circumcision to make yourself justified before God? No, no. So that's sort of how it fits in the broader
Mm.
picture of that letter. But I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I love what you just went through, and that really, those 7 or 8 dimensions that you have in just that one verse.
Yeah,
And there's been a lot of exegetes that really spend a lot of time, just like you just did, trying to understand each and every word and how they all play together and what have you. And there's a couple of things, and there are some hypotheses against that being the shroud,
yeah,
and one of them is whether the shroud as being such a valuable relic, that would John or Peter or anybody in Antioch that may have had the shroud. So one thing is possible is that the shroud was moved from Jerusalem to Antioch because the persecutors, the Romans and even the Jews in Jerusalem, the persecutions were very strong. Whereas in Antioch, I don't know how far away it was, 50, 100 miles. The persecution was a lot less strong. And so therefore you could be, as a Christian, as a proto-Christian, you could feel a lot safer there. And so then the shroud would be a lot safer there. And I think that's why, Jack Marquardt has it going to Antioch. And but then to actually allow someone like Paul, not that they wouldn't trust him. I'm sure they absolutely trusted him, 110%, but that they wouldn't trust him or anyone to take the shroud from Antioch up to Galatia, which is maybe a couple of 100 miles, and
yeah,
traversing with a very valuable cloth like that, you don't want it to get wet, you don't want it to get destroyed, you don't want it to get stolen. And and was Paul, was he traveling alone, or was he with who was he with? Was he with Timothy or Barnabas or Luke, or who was he with? And and there was probably other people that were with him, with them as well. And so then, there is the issue of how do you actually travel with something that valuable. And I mean, it could be one of the thoughts that I always have is, as we have those stains, the water stains that are on the cloth, and whether that was then, folded up and then folded again and fit into like a clay jar, and then that
Yeah.
clay jar was then carried, around with it in there, and then somehow it started raining. It wasn't kept in a house or in a building. It was, kept on a horse-drawn carriage while they were, carrying it up to Galatia. And
Yeah.
so maybe that happened. So the naysayers on that, not that they're naysayers on the authenticity of the shroud, but the naysayers of Galatians 3:1 is that it would have been very difficult to safely and securely travel with something that valuable and bring it up to Galatia and then bring it back.
Yeah.
Now, there is, of
There are
course,
things to say to respond to that as well. I mean, the shroud is very light. A lot of people don't realize that the shroud itself is probably only about 5 pounds. So it was rather versatile. It's a very thin piece of linen. It could be easily folded, and there's plenty of forensic evidence on the shroud itself of it having been folded in many different ways. Um, and I will say this too, like in terms of when would the shroud have been in Galatia? I admit I don't know. I tried to dig into the timeline of when Peter maybe may have gone up to Galatia, but his travels prior to the Jerusalem Council in the late 40s or early 50s, there any of the apostles' travels before then is really just not documented. So
yeah,
there's about a 20-year gap there where they don't really tell us who went where or what they did, but we do know that somebody went to these places and preached the gospel, because Paul can then write to them and say, "Don't you remember?" And it's
right,
not clear if Paul had been to Galatia before he had written the letter. I mean, obviously, he probably would have visited them and not just written to them out of the blue. But would he have been the one who had the shroud at that point? From the timeline that I was looking at in terms of like trying to determine when Paul was actually converted, when he had his Damascus road to Damascus experience, I don't think there was enough time. I also don't think that they would have given the shroud to him in particular for you know him being a prior persecutor of the church and all. I don't know. So it kind of depends. I mean, if the shroud did end up with Luke, according to the Saint Nino tradition slash legend, then at some point it's plausible that Paul had the shroud on him via Luke. But I don't think that Luke was with him yet um, by the time he
yeah,
was writing to Galatia. So I
yeah,
will admit, like, yeah, there's holes there that we really don't have any way to fill in those details, but it's still
right.
interesting.
Yeah, it sure is. Well, one thing too, so what I've been studying is the image of Odessa, which then some people believe, some shroud authenticists believes that the image of Odessa was the shroud. And there's legends of, how it got from Jerusalem up to Odessa. And one of them is that and Thomas, the Apostle Thomas, he was kind of given responsibility for that part of I guess it's Anatolia, Eastern Anatolia at that point, and then also that part of Syria, so that and then Persia and Mesopotamia, and we know that Thomas went we well we know we believe, the best evidence seems to show that he went all the way over to India and then was killed in India. And so now, if he was responsible for that area, and this cloth, the image of Edessa, made it to Edessa shortly after the resurrection, or right before the resurrection, um, well, it would have to have been after the resurrection. And it would, in order for it to have gotten to Edessa, there's a couple of writings that reference Thomas. There's the Gospel of Thomas, where inside the Gospel of Thomas, there's this thing called the Hymn of the Pearl, and the Hymn of the Pearl references a mirrored image of myself and it seems like it might potentially be referencing the shroud image, and that was written as well, and I believe it was written in either the late first century or early second century. I can't remember. And then
It's late second century
late
or
second
early
century,
third
yeah,
century. But
and that could
I
have been,
actually I agree with that assessment. By the way, when I read the whole Hymn of the Pearl. In fact, I read two or three different translations of it, and I think, you know, granted, we don't know how this author would have had access to the shroud or where they would have seen it, maybe in Odessa. But I mean, the cloth that is described in that poem is quite reminiscent of the shroud. It's
yeah,
actually a robe in the poem. It's a robe. It's not a burial linen. It's a robe that's given to this king, who seems
yeah.
to perhaps be Jesus or symbolic of Jesus. But yeah, either way, I mean, I think if anybody goes and reads the Hymn of the Pearl, uh, doesn't matter what English translation you use. I think you come away thinking that definitely sounds like somebody had knowledge of a kind of cloth or something that they were referring to.
Yeah, and it's not certain as to who wrote it. There's one of the people is Bardesaunus, and he was in I believe he was in the court of Apgar the Eighth at that time in the late second century, and so he may have written it, or it may have been his son that wrote it, and so there is some possibility there. So it is possible then that Thomas had it and that he, as he traveled from Antioch or Jerusalem up to Edessa, he would have probably traveled through Galatia, so that's possibly that. The other one is Thaddeus, Jude Thaddeus. It could have been him that carried the cloth with him, or was with Thomas somehow, and they both, somehow had access to the cloth, and then Bardesaunus, then left it in Edessa because the king Apgar at that time became a Christian, and he Christianized his whole kingdom there in the middle first century. And so it's possible that's how then the Galatians then actually were able to have seen clearly portrayed before them the crucified Christ, because either Thomas or Thaddeus had taken it through there, and they were showing it around to some of the churches maybe that Paul
Yeah.
had already been to. So I don't know that the timing may not work out exactly, because just because of the way things were after 33 AD, the resurrection, and then when it's believed that this image of Edessa, this cloth, actually showed up in Edessa. Now I do have some trouble though with then the next period of time. What we have as not necessarily written evidence, but certainly artistic evidence is in the early, couple of centuries there, we have the depiction of Jesus as a Roman, kind of like a typical Roman would be depicted, with short hair and no beard, and potentially either a crown or not, and then he'd be carrying a lamb, or he would be with a lamb, and then that changed really in the fourth century, in the late fourth century. The earliest artistic evidence I've seen is a marble inlay that looks like Jesus. He's got googly eyes, and it's a marble inlay, so he can't be that accurate. But he has what I call
Yeah.
googly eyes, and he has then the split beard, and that has a provenance back to about 395 AD. Um, and
Yeah.
so it's possible that the shroud was then now being seen. It's certainly after the Edict of Milan with Constantine, and so it could have been now that it's been more available, that people and artisans may have been allowed to see it so that they could start to make copies of it and depictions of it.
Yeah. It's worth mentioning too that during these early centuries, from the first century up through like the sixth century, during the provenance of the Byzantine Empire, roughly, that the that the roads between all of these cities were very easily accessible. It was the interstate of their day. So when we say things like, "Oh, they went from Jerusalem to Antioch to Odessa to Galatia," it's like that would have been easy to do. Would it have been dangerous to transport a precious sacred relic? Possibly, yes, depending on how the shroud was stored and how it was folded up and everything, and depending on who knew about it or who was looking for it. But it would have been relatively easy to travel between these places, which is why the apostles went that direction for the most part anyway in their original evangelistic routes. They went up into what we now call Turkey. And then, obviously some went this way and some went that way. John
Yeah.
ended up in Ephesus over on the west coast, which is sort of off the coast of Ephesus is where Patmos is, the island
Yeah.
where he was banished to. And all of these legends and supposed accounts through the discipline of the secret, they're all involved along these same routes. For example, the one that I think is really, really interesting, it's called The Inscription of Abercius Marcellus.
Yeah.
And he died in 167 AD. And there is a sort of a monument created for him where he basically, in his own words, he said that he had seen all the cities of Syria, which would have included Antioch, and he went to a place called Nisibis, which was near Odessa. And it says he carried with him a fish of exceeding great size that had wine of great virtue mingled with bread. And this is very strange language. Obviously, he doesn't literally mean that he was carrying a giant fish. There was symbolism there because we know that these early Christians were using the term ichthys, which was the Greek word for fish, as an acronym for Jesus, because those letters in Greek for ichthys actually end up meaning Jesus Christ, Son of God, Savior, or something along those lines. That's what that stood for, which is why we still have the fish symbol today as sort of our Christian symbol. So the fact that this inscription in the mid to late second century refers to this fish of exceeding great size with blood mingled with bread, um, it makes you think that he was carrying around something that was important.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and two, just to go back 1 second, the routes that you were talking about are basically the Silk Route.
yes,
And actually, there's a recent study that came out. I don't know if I believe it yet or not, but where there were a lot of pollen found on the shroud cloth, and through DNA testing, a lot of that came from China and India. And because of that, it's believed then that as the travelers from the Far East came through Edessa, they potentially touched it, potentially were in the presence of it, had maybe blessed it or venerated it rather with things that they had brought, and that then led to pollen being deposited on the cloth. Not
yeah,
sure I'm 100% there yet, but it's certainly an interesting study that has been done.
yeah.
And
And
so,
I've actually noticed this lately that this data has been going viral. Um, Ironically, skeptics have been trying to use it to say that the shroud was manufactured or made in India somehow. But that's not what the data indicates. They're confused about what that means. What it means is when Stirp went in 1978, they took these sticky tape samples from the surface of the shroud. Uh, none of that none of that has any bearing on how the shroud was made or even where it was made. All it shows is uh, who would have been around it, who would have handled it. I mean, it's possible that maybe the linen cloth itself could have been made in India. Joseph of Arimathea, he was rich, so he could purchase whatever he wanted for his burial. I don't know if that would have been proper for a Jew to purchase something from India like that for his own burial. But either way, like that's possible. But all this DNA and this pollen on there, it just shows like how much stuff got on the shroud. It doesn't really tell us anything about its origins, and it certainly doesn't. It certainly the DNA evidence certainly doesn't have any bearing on the blood, because the blood is a whole different thing from the sticky tape samples that included pollen and probably like dead skin cells from other regions of the world. But I just wanted
Right.
to clear that up because I've been seeing a lot of that lately online.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's all over the place now, and you're right. It's being used by skeptics and authenticists at the same time. So it is kind of fascinating. But yeah, so Abercius, Bishop Abercius of Hierapolis, and his burial, what do you call that? The burial monolith or something.
Yeah, I don't know exactly. I mean, it's just called an inscription, but
Yeah, yeah, and the burial thing there is stone. And yeah, so now Marquardt, he thinks that it was that Abercius brought the shroud over to Edessa for the conversion of Apgar the Eighth, and then he brought it back with him.
yeah,
And then he has it being potentially hidden away in one of the gates in Antioch, not the gate in Edessa. So there's one legend that the shroud was hidden for a couple of hundred years in the gate over the main entrance to Edessa. And that one I think has a high probability of being bunk. And the reason why I
okay,
say that is that image that I mentioned to you, if it was hidden, then how could this inlaid marble image have been made with the googly eyes and the split
sure,
beard? How could that have happened? And
yeah,
if it was hidden for those hundreds of years and brought out then in 544
yeah,
AD when Persia was besieging the city of Edessa, and then something was used to scare the Persians away, whatever that was, and so it some theories or legends have it that the image was found over the gate, and it was then marched around the outs well the walls of the city of Edessa, and that then scared the Persians away.
yeah, yeah. And this is where different shroud researchers go different routes. It's like we're all so close but so far because there are conflicting accounts of where these images ended up. Some would say Antioch, some would say Odessa. I'm right now. I'm kind of team Antioch myself, just because there's a slightly earlier mention of an image of Christ um, in Antioch, just slightly earlier than there is a mention of some kind of image being found in Odessa. And either way, I mean, I think these things are getting sort of conflated. Clearly,
Yeah.
something is being conflated because you can't have almost the exact same story coming out of the same city. But one thing for sure, and this is sort of the resource that I lean on in terms of figuring out which city, it would be Monk John Moskos reported in probably the early 6th century that there was um, an image of Jesus. I'm trying to find the exact wording that he used. Um,
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that one. That's interesting. I'll have to look that one up.
yeah, it says that he says he showed me the image of our Lord Jesus Christ, which was held in great honor, and this was being kept in Antioch. So he's referring to an image of Christ being held in Antioch at some point in the early 6th century.
And so early sixth century.
Yeah, and then the conflicting account, if you kind of want to go there, would be the late 6th century is when you get Evagrius Scholasticus, who
Yeah.
mentions uh, an image in Odessa. Now,
Yeah.
granted, I mean there are years between there. Um, the legend of the image being found in the city gate comes from Edessa, but at the same time, and I'm pretty sure Jack Markwart goes into this in his book as well. There are much better historical document. There's much better historical documentation for a bunch of reconstruction going on in Antioch, where they were doing all kinds of different construction and reconstruction, tearing old structures
Mm.
down and building up new ones. So there would have been reason for something to have been found in that city in particular. So it's very possible that these stories are getting conflated, and of course the reason why it would be conflated with Edessa would be because of this Abgar legend, and even the Abgars are getting mixed up because you have Abgar from first century versus Abgar from
Yep.
like fourth century,
No,
um,
second century. Yeah, the
second
195.
century. Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's all getting mixed up
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is we still end up landing in the same place, which is that somewhere between Antioch and Odessa, roughly, is where the shroud starts being. If it's the shroud, this image starts getting basically paraded around, and the people are just showing it off. And right there in the middle of the sixth century is when you get the Pantocrator icon that just spreads like wildfire across the region there, and that's
Mm.
the key one, especially in Egypt, that just it influences the rest of all Jesus art for all of eternity after that.
Yeah. Yeah.
the
Although
monastery
actually,
monastery of Saint Catherine.
yeah, yeah, in the Sinai Atticus, I think it's called. Yeah, that one, and that was from I think the late sixth century, as I recall, and it was a gift to the monastery there from the emperor at the time. And but there are one or two that are actually earlier than that that have very similar looks and feels, although not as good as not as well depicted as that one is. And then which is, there's no question that that one's a pretty strong depiction. Now, the other problem, though, of course, is that because of the iconoclasm, so the breaking of images in the seventh and early eighth centuries, especially in Constantinople, a lot of images were broken, destroyed, and burned and what have you because of this iconoclasm. And so you wonder if there were other images that were in the city at that time that were then lost to this iconoclasm.
Yeah, it really throws kind of a wrench in the whole history of icons in the whole
Yeah,
region, because this iconoclasm comes to the forefront, and it comes and goes in waves. And so clearly, if the shroud was to be preserved in that region, you would have to have somebody who was holding on to it for dear life, perhaps even risking their own life, recognizing it to be
yeah.
something incredibly special. And we don't know who that would have been. Probably, well, it would have had to have been multiple people throughout the centuries. Ironically, it actually becomes safer from those things once it's taken up to Constantinople,
Yeah,
because then it's sort
yeah.
of stashed away, and nobody can get into there.
Well, it's interesting because, and I've just come across a really interesting source. It's called the Exuviae I think it's either Paul or Philippe Riant, and he's French, and so I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but in any case, he wrote this Exuviae Sacrae Constantinopolae. So I can't remember what exuvia means, but sacred images or sacred something of Constantinople. And in there, I'm really amazed, and I'm not even done, getting through it yet. And there's like four or five references that to me anyway, seem just as strong as the Robert de Clary reference in the Fourth Crusade in 1204, but these are all in the mid 12th century, so 1150 up to the end of the 12th century. And so there's four or five references of this and that, And what's also interesting, and I'm kind of trying to piece all of this together now, is that there's Saint Mary of Blachernay, the church in at the one end, at the northern end of Constantinople, and then there's the Mother of God Pharaoh's chapel in the palace. And in the palace is all the references to an image are um, are in the Pharaoh's chapel, and all the references to the shroud are in the Saint Mary Blachernay. And so
Mm,
then they are definitely in two different locations. And so that image in the Pharaoh's chapel is then, as far as I can determine, is with high likelihood the Mandylion, the image of Odessa, whereas then the image cloth that's in the Saint Mary Blachernay is then the long cloth that gets displayed, on Easter and Good Friday.
yeah. Yeah. I'd love to hear more about that when you
Yeah,
have it
it's
all put
coming.
together.
It's only a month away, as I keep saying for the last two
Awesome.
years. So no,
Yeah.
it's a long way away. I mean, and the problem is, I mean, even what you've given me. You gave well, as we've been talking, you gave me another handful of sources that
Yeah.
I'll need to track down because what are they referencing to, and are they referencing?
Yeah.
So I was really writing, as you know, I'm writing on the image of Odessa, the Mandylion, and not as much on the shroud, with the hypothesis of, is the image of Odessa one and the same as the shroud? And
Yeah.
and I will admit, when I first started on it, I was like, 99% that they were two separate things. And then with all of these other references, I'm still pretty strong, maybe only 90% now, because there's some other references that also seem strong, where they're kind of one and the same. So
Yeah.
it'll be interesting. I'm still working on the one side there.
I wonder if I could mention at this point, because
Yeah.
I think I'm imagining a skeptic listening to our conversation here going, are you telling me there were a bunch of these images going around? Like, then why think that one was more special than the other? Why would that matter? And it's like, well, let's rewind and reset the picture here. We're not starting from nothing, because what I already gave you was these legends about the burial cloth, and these are being passed around in these first like 3 or 4 centuries after the resurrection. And then what happens is the that record sort of goes quiet, except for the discipline of the secret references that you have in like the inscription of Abercius. And there was another one we didn't even talk about. Let's see if I can have that name real quick. Theodore of Mopsuestia, who was a native of
Hmm.
Antioch. There's that one too, which we didn't even talk about. It's a Eucharistic ceremony. Um, and then what ends up happening is right here around the fifth or sixth centuries, you start getting these references to images, and these images, the way that they're described as akira poieton. They're described as images not made with human hands. And some of them, at least one of them, is being described as being linked as burial linen, as that burial linen of Jesus. And so, from a historical perspective, it would make sense that if the burial linens were being passed around and preserved some way, that eventually you're going to get some kind of reference to not just the burial linen, but the image on it. And it just so happens, this happens pretty early on in terms of all these references that we have. Now, another thing that shouldn't surprise us either is that um, people would want to copy this image, just as the art evidence depicts. Like, people wanted to know what Jesus looked like, so not only would they create works of art that would be in accordance with this image of Christ that they have, but they would also probably try to create duplications or replications of this image, either by trying to recreate the face. Um, you know, maybe that's what the image of Odessa was, some kind of recreation of the face, or just paint an image on a cloth,
Yep. Yep.
that, sort of like a tracing. You sort of put another cloth, thin cloth, over the shroud, and then you just sort of try to trace it. That wouldn't be out of the question at all, for somebody to do that. And
Yeah.
we know that
Yeah.
they were
Yeah.
doing this sort of thing anyway because iconography was being passed around. So
Yeah.
just because there are multiple references to multiple images is not a mark against the shroud. It actually helps establish that there is some kind of paper trail for this thing. We just don't exactly know which route it took. Did it go from Jerusalem up to Antioch, or did it go up through Odessa? It's not completely clear to us, but that doesn't mean that, it's all just made up. Clearly, something was being passed around, and then, as you mentioned, clearly there were several things being inventoried in Constantinople that
Yeah.
match this description. It's just a matter of, was it the one that went by this name, or was it the one that went by this name? It
Yeah.
was
Well, and that's
one of
then where all of these different references and what have you. We're going to need to break off here.
them. Right.
This has been awesome. Actually, I've written down a bunch of stuff, so I'm going to have to get a bunch of material from you.
Wait,
But
I think we should briefly touch on one more thing though,
okay, sure.
which is this question of when was it taken to Constantinople? Because this is also part of the mystery.
Yeah.
Because if it
Yeah.
was over
Yeah.
here, then it may have been taken up to Constantinople earlier, maybe in the late 6th century. There's also an idea that maybe it was taken up later in like the 9th century. And I
Yeah.
think that
944. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that you definitely know more about that than I do. So I'm curious what
Well,
you have to say about that.
yeah, well, let's hold that for our next talk because this has been
Okay.
fascinating and really appreciate it. And unfortunately, I do have to break off here, but I think we've got a pretty good coverage up to about certainly right after the first couple of centuries and what may have happened. And certainly there's a lot of speculation, and then there's various evidences going from the let's say the 300s up to maybe the 600s, and then we haven't even gotten into the next round yet. And how do
Yeah.
we get to 944 and then certainly 1204? So
Yeah.
anyway, let's hold off here. For really appreciate it, and so stay tuned and for our next round with Duran Smith, and we will do some really good stuff as well. And otherwise, for the audience, definitely stay tuned and go to GuyPowell.com and find out more about me and then the podcast and sign up for more podcasts. Duran, thank you so much. This has been wonderful.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'll be happy to come back and keep talking. There's so much more. Again, there's so much
I
stuff
know.
that people, especially that skeptics of the shroud, that they don't even know that a lot of this stuff exists because they never get
Yep.
past the carbon dating. You know, it's like
Yeah,
you
exactly.
haven't even begun to look at all of this stuff. But I do go into some of those things already in my videos too. If you go to my website, veramyth.com, my YouTube channel is Veramyth Pictures. So, all of my resources are there.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, we'll definitely look at that. So veramyth.com is what you said.
Yes,
And so Vera, VERIMYTH.com. So
correct.
definitely go there. All right, listen, let's break. I appreciate it. And thank you for the time today. And we will definitely be doing another session.
Yes, absolutely.